The winter of 1917 brought more than just snow to Albany, New York. For the Whitaker family, it carried a chill that seeped beyond flesh and bone into the very soul. As war raged across Europe, another battle, quieter but no less deadly, was about to unfold within the walls of their Victorian home on State Street. Margaret Whitaker stood by the hearth, watching flames dance as she arranged cups for evening tea. At 42, her face bore the dignified lines of a woman who had weathered life's storms with grace. Her husband, Charles, a prominent banker, sat in his leather armchair, newspaper rustling as he turned each page. Their 3 children, James, Elizabeth, and young Thomas, were scattered about the parlour in various states of quiet activity. The mantel clock struck 6, its chime echoing through the room just as a knock sounded at the front door. "That must be Uncle Edward," said Elizabeth, looking up from her book. At 17, she possessed her mother's keen eyes and her father's analytical mind. Margaret straightened her dress. "Remember your manners, all of you. Your uncle has travelled far." Charles folded his newspaper. From Boston to Albany in this weather, the man must be half frozen. When Margaret opened the door, a gust of wind carried snowflakes into the foyer, swirling around the tall figure of Edward Whitaker. Charles's younger brother cut an impressive silhouette, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit despite his journey, with a face that commanded attention. His eyes, a peculiar shade of amber, seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Brother," Edward said, his voice unexpectedly warm against his cold appearance. "It's been too long." Charles embraced him stiffly. 3 years, if I'm not mistaken." 3 years, 2 months and 14 days, Edward replied, removing his gloves with deliberate precision. "But who's counting?" The children approached cautiously. James, the eldest at 19, offered a firm handshake. Elizabeth curtsied politely. 10-year-old Thomas simply stared, transfixed by the pocket watch chain that glinted against Edward's waistcoat. "You've grown," Edward told them, his gaze lingering on each face as though memorizing their features. "All of you. Come warm yourself," Margaret said, guiding him toward the parlour. "Dinner will be ready shortly." The family gathered around the hearth, flames casting long shadows across the oriental rug. Edward declined tea, but accepted the chair closest to the fire. As conversation ebbed and flowed around current events, the war, President Wilson's policies, the influenza outbreaks in neighbouring cities, Margaret noticed how Edward never quite answered direct questions about his business dealings or his sudden decision to visit. "Banking has been lucrative," was all he offered when Charles inquired about his financial ventures. "Though these days I find myself drawn to more esoteric investments." "What brings you to Albany, Uncle?" James asked. "Surely Boston has better opportunities." Edward's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Family, dear nephew. In uncertain times, family becomes one's most valuable asset." Later, as they moved to the dining room, Margaret caught a peculiar sight. The large mirror in the hallway, an heirloom passed down through generations of Whitakers, reflected 5 figures passing, not 6. She blinked, certain her eyes were playing tricks. When she looked again, all 6 reflections were present. "Are you well, Margaret?" Edward asked suddenly beside her. His hand on her elbow felt unnaturally cold through the fabric of her sleeve. "Yes, just the light playing tricks," she murmured, unsettled by his scrutiny. Dinner progressed with the formal rhythm of upper-class propriety: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, simple but elegant fare in times of wartime conservation. Edward ate sparingly, complimenting Margaret's cooking while barely touching his plate. He spoke eloquently about European architecture, philosophy and art, subjects that revealed a worldliness beyond what his previous correspondence had suggested. "Uncle Edward," Thomas piped up during a lull in conversation, "where did you get that watch? It's different from father's." Edward withdrew the timepiece from his waistcoat pocket. It was indeed unusual, gold and silver intertwined in an intricate pattern, with symbols rather than numbers marking the hours. "This was a gift," he said, allowing Thomas to examine it without relinquishing his hold on the chain. "From a business associate in Vienna before the war. It's quite old, 16th century, I believe." "It's beautiful," Elizabeth said. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary." "Beauty often masks danger, my dear niece," Edward replied, his gaze uncomfortably intense. "The most exquisite roses bear the sharpest thorns." And after dinner, while the children retired to their rooms, the adults gathered in Charles's study. Edward produced a bottle of amber liquid from his travel bag. "A rare cognac," he explained, pouring 3 glasses. "Impossible to find these days, with trade disrupted. I thought we might indulge." The cognac burned pleasantly, warming Margaret from within as Edward outlined his proposal. "I've come to discuss an inheritance matter," he said, setting his glass down. "Our grandfather's trust is maturing next month. There are decisions to be made." Charles frowned. "What inheritance? Grandfather left everything to father, and father left everything to us, split evenly, as I recall." Edward's smile tightened. "Not everything, brother. There were provisions, specifically regarding the State Street property." "This house?" Margaret asked, suddenly alert. "But Charles's father left clear title." "Not the house itself," Edward interrupted. "What lies beneath it?" A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the occasional pop from the fireplace. Outside, snow began to fall more heavily, blanketing Albany in white. "You're speaking in riddles," Charles said finally. "What exactly do you want?" Edward leaned forward, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight. "I need access to the cellar. There's a sealed room. You may not even know it exists. Grandfather's journals mention a repository of sorts. Family artifacts, historical documents, items of considerable value." "Value to whom?" Charles asked. "To collectors? To historians?" Edward paused. "To me." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. "And what would you do with these items?" "Preserve them. Study them." Edward's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Complete what grandfather started." Later that night, after Edward had retired to the guest room, Margaret stood before the hallway mirror. Her reflection stared back, pale and troubled. Charles approached, placing his hands on her shoulders. "You're worried," he observed. "There's something not right about Edward," she confessed. "He's changed." 3 years changes many men," Charles said reasonably, "especially with the world as it is now." "It's more than that." Margaret turned to face her husband. "Did you notice how he barely ate? How he never removed his jacket, even by the fire? And earlier I could have sworn—" She stopped herself. "What?" "Nothing. Just a trick of the light." She shook her head. "But Charles, this talk of an inheritance, of things beneath the house, your father never mentioned any of this." Charles sighed. "Father was a private man, and Edward always did have an imagination. We'll hear him out, examine whatever documents he has, and proceed accordingly. And if there is something beneath the house, then it belongs to both of us, as father intended." Charles kissed her forehead. "Don't worry. Edward will return to Boston soon enough, and things will return to normal." But as Margaret prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that normal was a luxury they might never again afford. Outside her window, the snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the city, until all that remained was the whisper of her own troubled thoughts and the distant ticking of Edward's strange watch from down the hall. 3 days passed, and Edward Whittaker showed no signs of departing. Each morning he emerged from the guest room impeccably dressed, despite never receiving any luggage beyond his small traveling case. Each night he retired late, after long conversations that left Charles thoughtful and Margaret increasingly uneasy. The children reacted differently to their uncle's extended presence. James remained politely distant, preoccupied with his imminent enlistment, something Charles had forbidden to discuss at the dinner table. Elizabeth found herself drawn to Edward's vast knowledge of literature and art, often seeking his company in the library. Young Thomas alternated between fascination and fear, trailing Edward through the house until sharply shooed away. On the 4th evening, As snow continued to blanket Albany, Edward finally produced the documents he'd mentioned. Leather-bound journals, yellowed with age, their pages covered in cramped handwriting. "Grandfather's private diaries," he explained as Charles, Margaret and James gathered in the study. 7 volumes spanning 30 years. Charles took one, carefully turning brittle pages. "I never knew these existed." "Few did. He entrusted them to me shortly before his death." Edward withdrew a folded paper from inside the cover of the largest journal. "And this is the architectural diagram of the house, the original blueprints from 1848. Notice this section here." He pointed to a portion of the cellar outlined in faded red ink. Unlike the rest of the precisely drawn floor plan, this section contained symbols rather than measurements, strange, angular markings that seemed to serve no architectural purpose. "What are these markings?" James asked, leaning closer. "Notation system," Edward replied smoothly. "Grandfather was eccentric in his record-keeping." Margaret studied the diagram with growing concern. "We've lived here 15 years, and I've never seen any sealed room in the cellar." "It wouldn't be visible without knowing where to look," Edward said. "That was the intention." Charles frowned. "What exactly do you believe is down there, Edward?" "Family heirlooms, historical artifacts, perhaps financial instruments, bearer bonds, gold certificates." Edward's expression remained carefully neutral. Grandfather was known to distrust banks, despite, or perhaps because of, his involvement in founding several, including ours, Charles noted dryly. "Indeed." Edward gathered the papers. "I propose we investigate tomorrow. The 3 of us, men's work after all." Margaret stiffened. "This is my home too, Edward." "Of course, sister-in-law. I meant no offense." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Your presence would be most welcome." That night, Margaret woke suddenly, heart pounding. The bedroom was frigid despite the banked fire. Charles slept soundly beside her, oblivious to the cold. She rose, drawing her robe tight, and moved to check the window for drafts. A movement in the corner mirror caught her eye, a shadow passing in the hallway. Thinking one of the children might be ill, she opened the bedroom door. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, lit only by moonlight filtering through windows at each end. But as she turned to go back to bed, something made her pause. The large mirror at the hall's end reflected the corridor perfectly, except for one detail. In the reflection, a figure stood by the stairs, Edward watching her. Margaret gasped and spun around. The hallway remained empty. When she looked back at the mirror, it showed only an empty corridor. Sleep eluded her for the remainder of the night. By morning, rationality had reasserted itself. A dream, she told herself. Nothing more than an overwrought imagination fueled by her unease about Edward's presence. Breakfast passed with strained normalcy. Edward appeared last, looking as fresh as if he'd slept deeply, though Margaret noticed dark circles beneath Elizabeth's eyes. "Did you sleep well, dear?" she asked her daughter quietly. Elizabeth hesitated. "I had strange dreams. About Uncle Edward, actually." She lowered her voice further. "He was standing by my bed, just watching. It seemed so real." Before Margaret could respond, Edward announced it was time to examine the cellar. Charles agreed, and James eagerly volunteered to join them. Margaret insisted on coming along, ignoring Charles's concerned glance. The cellar of the State Street house was typical of its era. Stone walls, dirt floor in some sections, rough wooden shelving filled with preserves and household supplies. Charles led the way with a kerosene lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. "According to the diagram," Edward said, consulting the blueprint, "the sealed room should be behind this north wall." "That's solid stone," Charles objected. "There's no door, no seam, nothing to indicate a passage." Edward ran his hands along the rough surface, fingers tracing patterns only he could see. "Not everything is visible to the untrained eye, brother." For nearly an hour they examined the wall without success. James began to look bored, Charles irritated. Only Edward maintained his intense focus until suddenly he stopped at a particular stone block. "Here." He pressed firmly on the block's center, then pushed it inward. The stone recessed with a grinding sound, revealing a small niche containing what appeared to be an iron lever. Charles stared in disbelief. "How did you—" "Grandfather's journals were quite detailed," Edward said, reaching for the lever. "Shall we?" When he pulled the lever, a section of wall, perhaps 4 feet wide, slid back and to the side with surprising smoothness, revealing a dark aperture beyond. "Remarkable," James whispered. "A hidden room, just as Uncle said." Charles raised the lamp, illuminating a narrow passage that led to a small chamber beyond. The walls were lined with shelves containing boxes, books, and objects draped in cloth. A table stood in the center, its surface covered by a large leather portfolio. Edward entered first, his movements betraying familiar ease, as though he'd been in this room before. Margaret followed, noting with unease how the air inside felt different, colder, yet somehow stale and heavy. "Look at this," Charles marveled, examining a wooden box containing gold coins. "Spanish doubloons, and these appear to be Confederate bonds." James had discovered a collection of antique weapons, Civil War-era pistols, a Revolutionary War sword, all meticulously preserved. Only Margaret noticed how Edward ignored these treasures, moving directly to the table, where he opened the portfolio to reveal documents in the same cramped handwriting as the journals. "What are those?" she asked, moving closer. Edward covered the papers with his arm. "Family genealogy. Quite boring, really." But Margaret had glimpsed strange diagrams, symbols similar to those on Edward's watch, and what appeared to be calculations involving phases of the moon. "Perhaps we should catalogue everything properly," Charles suggested, examining a particularly fine emerald ring. "This represents a significant addition to the family estate." "Of course," Edward agreed smoothly, "though some items require specialized handling, the documents in particular." "Specialized how?" Margaret pressed. "Age, fragility, historical context." Edward closed the portfolio. "I've studied such materials extensively. Perhaps I should take the documents to Boston for proper preservation, while you manage the more conventional valuables." Charles hesitated. "I'm not comfortable with anything leaving the house until we've thoroughly assessed everything." A flash of something, anger, fear, crossed Edward's face before his composure returned. "As you wish, though time is of the essence. Some of these materials are deteriorating as we speak." They spent the remainder of the day cataloguing the room's contents. The hidden chamber yielded a remarkable collection. Coins from various eras and nations, jewelry, including several pieces that Margaret recognized from old family portraits, rare books in multiple languages, and documents dating back to the early 1700s. Most curious were objects of no obvious value or purpose: a silver box containing soil, a vial of what appeared to be dried blood, a small mirror in an ornate frame, its surface oddly clouded. "What is all this?" James asked, holding up the mirror. Edward snatched it from him. "Careful, some of these items are ceremonial, family traditions long forgotten." "What kind of ceremonies involve blood and dirt?" Margaret asked pointedly. Edward's smile turned cold. "Our ancestors had unconventional interests. The scientific study of life and death was less regulated in previous centuries." That evening, dinner was a tense affair. Edward proposed that he stay another week to help organize the newly discovered collection. Charles reluctantly agreed, though Margaret noticed his enthusiasm for the hidden treasure had dimmed considerably after hours in that oppressive room. Later, as Margaret prepared for bed, Elizabeth appeared at her door, pale and visibly shaken. "Mother, may I speak with you?" Margaret ushered her in, concerned by her daughter's trembling hands. "What's wrong, dear?" "It's Uncle Edward," Elizabeth whispered. "I saw something impossible." "What do you mean?" Elizabeth twisted her hands in her lap. "I was passing by the library, and he was inside, reading by lamplight. I glanced in the mirror that hangs opposite the door, and—" She faltered. "Go on," Margaret urged gently. "He wasn't there. In the mirror, I mean." The chair was empty, the book suspended in mid-air. But when I looked directly at him, he was there. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "Am I going mad, Mother?" Margaret's blood ran cold as her own mirror experience came rushing back. "No, darling, you're not mad. Then what explanation is there? People don't just not reflect." Margaret had no answer. Instead, she held her daughter close, mind racing. Two separate incidents couldn't be dismissed as imagination. There was something profoundly wrong with Edward Whittaker, something that defied rational explanation. "Say nothing of this to your father yet," Margaret cautioned. "I need to confirm something first." After Elizabeth left, Margaret retrieved a small hand mirror from her dressing table. She would need evidence before approaching Charles, who would certainly demand a logical explanation. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would watch Edward carefully, mirror in hand. She slept fitfully, waking often to listen for footsteps in the hallway. Shortly before dawn, she distinctly heard the cellar door open and close. Rising quietly to avoid waking Charles, she wrapped herself in her robe and crept downstairs. The cellar door stood slightly ajar, a faint light visible below. Margaret descended cautiously, one step at a time, careful to avoid the boards that creaked. Through the gap of the hidden room's entrance, she saw Edward hunched over the table, whispering words in a language she didn't recognize. The strange watch lay before him, its hands moving backward as he traced symbols on a parchment with what appeared to be his own blood. Margaret must have made some small sound, for Edward suddenly looked up, his amber eyes reflecting the lamplight like a cat's. "Curious, sister-in-law." His voice carried a new edge, something ancient and hungry. "Or merely reckless?" Margaret stepped back. "What are you doing, Edward?" "Completing what should have been finished decades ago." He rose, blocking her view of the table. "A pity you couldn't sleep. This would have been easier without interference." "What would be easier?" Margaret's hand tightened around the small mirror in her pocket. Edward smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp in the lamplight. "The restoration, the return, the reclaiming of what was stolen. I don't understand." "No, you don't." He moved toward her with unnatural grace. "Tell me, Margaret, do you know why Charles's father really left the family business? Why he moved your family from Boston to Albany? It wasn't for the banking opportunities, I assure you." Margaret backed toward the stairs. "He wanted a fresh start." Edward laughed softly. "He was running from me, from his obligations, from the truth about our family's special heritage." "What heritage?" "We Whittakers have always been different, since 1692 to be precise." Edward's eyes gleamed. Salem was such a confused time. So many innocent women accused, while the real practitioners went undetected. A chill ran down Margaret's spine. Practitioners of what? Arts both dark and illuminating. Edward was close enough now that she could feel the unnatural cold emanating from him. Our ancestor Jonathan Whittaker made a covenant, a bargain, if you will. In exchange for certain concessions, he received gifts, longevity, knowledge, power. "You're speaking of witchcraft," Margaret whispered. "Such a primitive term for something so sophisticated." Edward reached for her. "The covenant passes through the bloodline, Margaret. Every generation, one must step forward to renew it. Your husband's father refused his duty. Now the time grows short." Margaret pulled the mirror from her pocket and held it up. The lamp behind Edward was clearly reflected, as was the stone wall. But where Edward stood, there was nothing but empty space. "You're not human," she gasped. Edward's smile widened. "Not entirely, no, not anymore." He plucked the mirror from her trembling hand. "But I remain a Whittaker, and I require a Whittaker to complete the covenant. Charles will never—" "Not Charles!" Edward's voice dropped to a whisper. "Young blood is required. James, Elizabeth, or Thomas, one must be prepared for the transfer." Horror flooded Margaret's veins. "My children? Never!" "The choice isn't yours," Edward said calmly. "By dawn on the winter solstice, 3 days from now, one will be chosen. The others may continue their lives, unaware of what their sibling has become. I'll tell Charles everything. He won't believe you." Edward's confidence was absolute. "What will you say? That his brother casts no reflection? That ancient blood magic is real? That Salem's witch trials actually caught a few genuine practitioners?" He laughed. "He'll think you hysterical. By the time he accepts the truth, it will be too late." Margaret turned to flee, but Edward caught her arm, his grip painfully cold. "Listen carefully," he hissed. "Interfere, and all 3 children will suffer. Cooperate, and 2 will be spared. 1 sacrifice to continue the covenant. That is the bargain." "What covenant?" Margaret demanded. "With whom?" Edward released her, his eyes now entirely inhuman, vertical pupils in pools of amber. "With those who wait beyond the veil. Those who grant power in exchange for vessels." He stepped back. 3 days, Margaret. Choose which child will serve." Margaret fled upstairs, tears blinding her as she ran to the master bedroom. Charles stirred as she entered, reaching for her in the darkness. "Margaret, what's wrong?" She stood frozen, words failing her. How could she explain what she'd witnessed, what Edward had become, what he intended for one of their children? "Nothing," she lied, her mind racing. "Just, I couldn't sleep." As she slipped back into bed, Margaret knew she couldn't wait for Charles to believe the impossible. Whatever Edward was, whatever he planned, she had 3 days to stop him. Alone, if necessary. Outside, the snow continued falling, burying Albany under a silent blanket of white. And somewhere in the house, Edward Whittaker continued his preparations, patient as only the truly immortal can be. The next morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. Margaret rose early, having barely slept, her mind consumed with planning. She needed allies, evidence, and most critically, time. 3 days until the winter solstice, 3 days to save her children from Edward's covenant. At breakfast, she studied her family with new eyes. Charles, reading his newspaper, oblivious to the supernatural threat under his roof. James, discussing his college studies, unaware that his uncle coveted his young blood. Elizabeth picking at her food, still unsettled by what she'd seen in the mirror, and Thomas chattering about the snow fort he planned to build, blissfully ignorant of the danger. Edward appeared last, immaculately dressed as always. "Good morning, family," he said pleasantly, as though his midnight confrontation with Margaret had never occurred. "I trust everyone slept well?" His gaze locked with Margaret's, challenge evident in those inhuman eyes. She held his stare, refusing to show fear despite the hammering of her heart. "I was thinking," Charles said, folding his newspaper, "that we might invite Dr. Harrison to examine some of those artifacts we discovered. His expertise in historical items would be valuable." Edward's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "An unnecessary complication, brother. Family matters should remain private." "Harrison is practically family," Charles countered. "He's been our physician for a decade." Perhaps next week," Edward suggested smoothly, "after I've had time to properly catalogue everything." Margaret saw her opportunity. "Actually, I already sent Thomas with a note this morning. Dr. Harrison is coming for tea this afternoon." Edward's expression darkened momentarily before he regained his composure. "How efficient of you, sister-in-law." After breakfast, Margaret managed a moment alone with Elizabeth in the kitchen. "I need your help," she whispered, glancing toward the door to ensure they weren't overheard. "You were right about what you saw. Uncle Edward has no reflection." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "Then I'm not—" "No, you're not imagining things," Margaret confirmed. "There's something deeply wrong with him. I need you to help me watch him, but carefully. Don't let him know we suspect anything." "What is he?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. Margaret hesitated. "I'm not entirely sure, but he means harm to this family, specifically to you, children. Should we tell father?" "Not yet. Your father believes in what he can see, touch, and explain. We need evidence he can't dismiss." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hands. "For now, never be alone with Edward. Always make sure James or Thomas is with you if I'm not present. The arrival of Dr. Harrison that afternoon introduced a welcome buffer. Harrison, a portly, jovial man with spectacles and a walrus mustache, had been the family's physician and friend since their arrival in Albany. He possessed a keen interest in history and antiquities, making Charles's request to examine the discovered items entirely natural. Edward remained coldly polite as they led Harrison to the hidden cellar room, though Margaret noticed how he positioned himself to block access to certain shelves and drawers. "Extraordinary," Harrison exclaimed, examining a set of surgical tools dating from the Civil War. "And you say this room was sealed for decades?" "At least since my grandfather's time," Charles confirmed, though Edward seems to have known of its existence. Harrison turned to a leather-bound book whose cover bore strange symbols. "Fascinating. This appears to be written in a cipher of some kind." Edward smoothly took the book from his hands. "Family record-keeping system. Rather tedious business ledgers, I'm afraid." "I have some experience with historical ciphers," Harrison offered. "During the war, I briefly assisted with—" "Your expertise in medicine is renowned, Doctor," Edward interrupted. "Let's not waste your valuable time on financial minutiae." Harrison looked surprised, but didn't press the issue. As they continued the tour, Margaret maneuvered to stand beside the doctor. "Harrison," she whispered while Charles and Edward examined a collection of coins, "could you join me in the garden briefly? There's a medical matter I'd like to discuss." Outside, in the frozen garden where bare trees stood like sentinels against the winter sky, Margaret shared her concerns, carefully edited to omit the supernatural elements. "I fear Edward may be unwell. Mentally," she explained. "His behavior is increasingly erratic. He speaks of family covenants, of sacrifices that must be made. I'm concerned for the children's safety." Harrison frowned. "Has he threatened them directly?" "Not in so many words," Margaret admitted, "but there's something in his manner, in the way he watches them. And he's fixated on the winter solstice, says something must happen by then." "The solstice holds significance in many belief systems," Harrison mused. "Some of them quite esoteric." "What do you mean?" Harrison hesitated. "During my time in Europe, I encountered certain fringe philosophical societies. They often centered their rituals around astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, eclipses." "What kind of rituals?" Margaret pressed. "Nothing sinister in most cases. Meditation, fasting, symbolic ceremonies." He adjusted his spectacles. "Though some of the more extreme groups did practice blood rituals, believing that life essence could be transferred from one person to another." Margaret's blood ran cold. Edward mentioned something similar about vessels and transfers. Harrison's expression grew grave. "Margaret, if you truly believe Edward poses a threat to your family, you should contact the authorities." "And tell them what?" "That my brother-in-law wants to conduct a blood ritual on the solstice." She shook her head. "They'd dismiss me as hysterical." "No, I need tangible proof of his intentions." "What can I do to help?" Margaret thought quickly. "Could you return tomorrow? Bring your camera, the one you use to document battlefield wounds. Say you want to photograph the artifacts for historical records." "And the real reason?" "I need to prove what I've seen," Margaret said carefully. "About Edward. There are physical anomalies that might be captured by photography." Harrison looked skeptical, but agreed. "Tomorrow afternoon, then." When they returned inside, Edward was alone in the parlor, standing by the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, emphasizing its unnatural pallor. "A pleasant chat?" he asked, his tone deceptively mild. "Dr. Harrison was advising me on Thomas's persistent cough," Margaret lied smoothly. Edward smiled. "How fortunate we have such a dedicated physician, though I find traditional medicine often overlooks alternative approaches." "Science has served my patients well enough," Harrison replied. "Science." Edward pronounced the word as though it amused him. "Such a recent concept in the grand scheme. Our ancestors understood truths that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. Medical knowledge has advanced considerably, Harrison began. Has it? Edward interrupted. Can your science explain why some men live nearly twice the natural span? Why certain bloodlines carry unique attributes? Can it explain what truly happens when the soul departs the body? An uncomfortable silence followed. Harrison cleared his throat. Well, I should be going. Charles mentioned you found some historical medical instruments. I'd love to photograph them tomorrow, if convenient. Something dangerous flashed in Edward's eyes. Photography. Such an interesting technology, capturing light, creating permanent images. He moved closer to Harrison. Did you know certain subjects cannot be properly captured by a camera? Fascinating limitations of the medium. I've encountered challenging subjects, Harrison replied. Proper lighting usually resolves the issue. Perhaps? Edward's smile didn't reach his eyes. Until tomorrow then, Doctor. After Harrison departed, Edward cornered Margaret in the hallway. You're becoming a problem, he said quietly. First mirrors, now cameras. You think you're being clever. Margaret lifted her chin. I don't know what you mean. The good doctor won't help you, Edward continued as if she hadn't spoken. By tomorrow, he'll have forgotten this conversation entirely. A simple suggestion planted in his mind will ensure that. You can't control people's thoughts. Edward laughed softly. After what you've witnessed, you still underestimate what I can do? Foolish, Margaret. Very foolish. That night, Margaret kept watch from her bedroom, a kitchen knife hidden beneath her pillow. Around midnight, she heard soft footsteps in the hallway, too light to be Charles or James. Silently, she opened her door a crack. Edward stood outside Elizabeth's room, one pale hand on the doorknob. Margaret's heart seized. Step away from my daughter's room, she commanded, emerging fully into the hallway, knife now visible in her hand. Edward turned, seeming more amused than threatened. Ah, the maternal instinct, so predictable yet always impressive. What do you want with Elizabeth? I'm merely assessing options. His gaze flicked to the knife. That won't harm me, you know. Perhaps not, Margaret acknowledged, but it would certainly alert the household if I started screaming while plunging it into your chest. Edward considered this, then inclined his head slightly. A temporary impasse, then. He moved away from Elizabeth's door. But remember, Margaret, the solstice approaches. One way or another, the covenant will be fulfilled. The following day brought unexpected complications. Dr. Harrison never arrived for his scheduled visit. When Charles telephoned his office, Harrison's nurse reported he had been called away unexpectedly to attend a patient in Schenectady. How convenient, Margaret muttered. What was that, dear? Charles asked. Nothing. She forced a smile. Just disappointed we'll have to reschedule. Throughout the day, Edward remained conspicuously visible, engaging Charles in discussions about the family business, helping James with a university assignment, even offering to read to Thomas before bedtime, an offer Margaret firmly declined. By evening, Margaret's nerves were frayed to breaking. 2 days until the solstice, no outside help forthcoming, no evidence Charles would accept, and 3 children to protect from a creature she barely understood. After dinner, as the family gathered in the parlor, Margaret noticed Elizabeth staring intently at the large mirror above the fireplace mantel. Following her daughter's gaze, Margaret saw what had captured her attention. While the rest of the family was clearly reflected, the armchair where Edward sat appeared empty. Elizabeth's eyes met Margaret's in the mirror, silent confirmation passing between them. Is something fascinating about my reflection, niece? Edward asked suddenly, causing Elizabeth to flinch. I was just admiring the frame, she stammered. It's very ornate. Edward smiled coldly. Indeed, one should always appreciate fine craftsmanship. He turned to Charles. Brother, I've been meaning to discuss the journals we found. Several passages mention a ritual traditionally performed on the solstice, a family custom I thought we might revive. Charles looked up from his newspaper. What sort of ritual? Nothing elaborate. A gathering, certain words spoken, a small offering to honor our ancestors. Edward's tone was carefully casual. I thought perhaps the children might participate, connect them to their heritage. Margaret tensed. The children will be attending Christmas services at St. Peter's on the solstice evening. Before that, surely, Edward pressed. It would only take an hour at sunset. Before Charles could respond, a knock at the front door interrupted the conversation. James went to answer it, returning moments later with a telegram addressed to Edward. The change in Edward's demeanor as he read the message was immediate and dramatic. His face, already pale, seemed to drain of what little color remained. For the first time since his arrival, he appeared genuinely unsettled.